Welcome back to the Outshipping YouTube channel. My name's Austin, and in today's video we're going to be tackling a job that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and that is replacing the oil pan gasket and rear main seal on this 99 Jeep Cherokee with a 4.0 inline 6 engine. Now, I've been putting off this job for a long time. It's been leaking for thousands of miles and it just continues to get worse, so today we're going to fix that. I'm going to show you guys how to do the whole job from start to finish and all the parts I'm going to be using in this video for this job. So let's get started. Alright, so before we dive into the Jeep, let's take a quick look at all the components that we're going to be installing today. So to start off, we got some FEL-PRO gaskets. We have a FEL-PRO oil gasket in this box down here, and then we have a rear main seal, which is primarily what our oil is coming from, since it is leaking towards the back of the oil pan, and that's where it's located. Along with that, I got some gasket maker that we're going to be using with our oil pan gasket. This one right here, you want to make sure it's oil resistant so it holds up for a long time, so that's what we got right here. This is the Ultra Black Permatex, and it says right on there oil resistant, so that's what we're going to be using today. Now, since I'm going in there dropping the oil pan anyway, I went ahead and spent the extra money and ordered a new oil pump and oil pickup, and that's what's in these two boxes right here. These are by MELLING, which makes very good made in the USA components. With this Jeep having well over 300,000 miles, it just makes sense to replace it here today. My oil pressure actually isn't terrible as what I've seen other people with this Jeep engine, but we're going to go in there and replace it anyway because they do wear over time, just like any other engine component. And it'll help with our oil pressure so we have good oil flow throughout the rest of the engine. Now, along with that, obviously since we're dropping the oil pan, we're going to be doing an oil change as well. In the summer times here in Wisconsin, what I like to run is 10W30 Shell Rutella. It's got a lot more of a better additive package since it is a diesel engine oil with these flat tappet engines. Modern engine oil doesn't necessarily cut it with these older ones, so I go with 10W30. It's fairly cheap. We got 2 jugs here. We only need about 6 quarts or a little bit more since we're going to be dropping that pan. Just going to be a little bit more oil that comes out compared to a normal oil change. Got a Wix XP filter right here, and then I also like to run a zinc additive right here. Once again, being a flat tappet engine, it needs that extra zinc to have that sacrificial layer of protection in the engine. So we're going to be putting that in there as well. But overall, that's pretty much it, and you can get this job done with basic hand tools, nothing special with this. So the overall process on the Jeep is we have to lift up the front end and actually have that front axle droop down as far as it can go, and that'll give us a lot more clearance to get that oil pan out of there. So that's why I'm going to start here first today. Jack it up by the frame, so let that axle droop down up front, and then we can drain the oil and then get that oil pan off and go from there. So let's head over to the Jeep. Alright, so once we got it jacked up in the air, first thing we got to do is drop our oil. A little tip before doing this job, it's going to help so oil's not dripping on you once you remove the oil pan, is just to let the Jeep sit for a few days because there's still oil that drips from the top end back into the pan. And once you're doing the rear main, it's not too fun getting oil dripped on you constantly. For me, I had this sit for over a week, so we should be good once we remove the oil pan. Alright, so while we're waiting for our oil to drain, the next thing I'm going to do is actually take off this lower engine mat that's right here. There's be full of water and stuff. But basically that's just held in by some plastic Christmas tree hooks. So we want to undo those, get that out of here, then we should have full access to our oil pan. With all those out, should be able to pull this out from the front. There we go. Alright, so with that engine mat off, we can see the front half of our oil pan right here, and it's looking pretty gross with all this oil leak that's built up over the years. It just kind of turns into a grease and everything when it mixes with dirt from the road and such. But basically, we got a lot of bolts going around on this. So once we take this off, we have to make sure we put it back in the same exact spots, because not all these bolts are the same. Some of them have studs on them, and some of them are just normal bolts, and there's a couple of them that are different sizes, like these 1/2-inch bolts that are going to be located in each of the 4 corners. But before we get to those, the next thing we're going to do is take off some other things that utilize those studs that come off of the oil pan gasket bolts, and such as these transmission lines right here. There's a little bracket. So first thing I'm going to do is unbolt the lines from the bracket. There's an 8mm screw right here, and then we also have the same thing over here on the other side, 8mm screw, and then from there we should be able to take off the brackets because we can move this line around. Also note on the other side, depending on the year of your Cherokee, mine being a 99, I have another bracket way back over here, and that's where our O2 sensor connector is located. It's just put up here in the bracket, so it's held in by another plastic Christmas tree hook. So we're just going to pop that out and then move that out of the way, and then we can start tackling these bolts. So I'm going to get this out with the 8mm. And then, as you can see, that frees up our lines. I'm going to put this screw back in the bracket for now, so that way I don't lose it. This one over here appears to be stripped out, but that's fine. We'll just take off the bracket altogether once we undo it from the oil pan. Pop that O2 sensor connector out of the way. Looks like there's a zip tie that held something in place, but it's broken. That's attached to one of the studs right here, so we're going to pull that off as well. There we go. Alright, so now the next thing I'm going to do is actually start taking out some bolts. Most of them are going to be 7/16, and then we also, on the quarters, like I said before, those are going to be 1/2 inch. I'm going to start by taking out all the 7/16 bolts, and then we'll be at the end with the 4 1/2-inch ones when we finally drop our pan. But as I take these off, I'm going to note exactly where they are, so I'll just lay them out to the side, so I put them back in the same exact location. And that bolt is coming off with this bracket, or this bracket's coming off with this bolt. You can see they just kind of put a jam nut on there, but that did break free before it did on the oil pan, so that's why it came off like that. Alright, so I'm just going to continue and get all the bolts around here. It's going to be a little bit tight around the starter. Some people remove the starter, but if you have some swivels on some extensions, you can get those bolts out and not have to remove the starter and deal with that. So just take your time, get all the bolts out, lay them out where they should, and we'll be back ready to drop this pan. Alright, so all the 7/16 hardware I got removed. Some of them are pretty tight, so I just had to use a normal ratchet to get around where the exhaust manifold is over here on the driver's side and the starter over here. Just easier to get in there without having the impact. But got them all removed, and now we're just left with the 1/2-inch hardware, one in each corner holding this pan into place. Now the way this pan is going to drop out of here is it's going to drop down about 6 inches, and then it's going to go back over the axle and come out the rear over here. So what I'm going to do is crack the front 1/2-inch bolts free over here, then we go to the back, remove those two, and then from there it should actually drop down the back. I'll hold it in place, come back up here, remove the fronts, and then we can get this oil pan out of here. So I'll crack this guy free, so that way when I remove the back ones, it isn't tight up here where it's going to possibly bend the flange on that oil pan. And now it's time to get some cardboard or whatever to put down here, because there's going to be some oil dripping if you don't want it on your concrete. So these last two ones are going to be up here in between the transmission and the oil pan. It's kind of tight, so you'll need a couple extensions, but the 1/2-inch bolts are basically one on each side of where our crankshaft is, and that's basically where our rear main seal is, also on the inside. Alright, you can see it's already starting to come loose. get ready to catch this because this will start to come out. And then once you remove the back over here, you have this strap that kind of gives it support around that back semicircle area of the oil pan, so that's going to come out with it as well. I'm just going to let that hang. It's kind of holding up on the transmission lines. Then I'll come up front, get that last bolt removed, and then this will be out of here. All right. So I'm going to slowly guide this down. We're going to have to weave it around the transmission lines up here. Alright, so the main thing, once we get it free of the transmission lines, what we have to work around is basically our axle. That's where it's kind of heading. So that's why we want to make sure we drop the axle as far as it goes. Hopefully I don't have to lift this up even more. But I think we just need to wiggle this out of here and that should come free. Alright, so got that out of place. It fell out. Just had to actually jack up the Jeep even more, put it on higher jack stand. So this front axle is actually fully drooping. There's about an inch gap. So it's the lowest the suspension can go right now without taking off any components. And then I just kind of pushed up towards the front of the oil pan. So that way it kind of tilts a little bit because it has to get around this axle tube. That's where it's really hung up on. It has to drop below the bell housing to be able to slide out. And I just pushed it up and then it just came out right away. So I'm going to finish taking this out. There's still going to be a little bit of oil in it, so try not to tip it or anything like that. And I'm just going to bring it forward. Alright, so now with that oil pan out of the way, let's take a closer look at what's all going on. As you can tell, first thing right here, this is our oil pickup that sits down in our oil pan, sucks up oil into our oil pump, which is located right here. So that's why I'm replacing that. It's nice, easy access while we have the pan out. Why not change it right away? So we're going to remove that. Another thing we're going to have to remove to be able to get at our rear main seal is this metal piece right here. This is called our engine girdle. It's found on 96 and up 4.0 Jeep engines. And it's basically just attached to all the main bearing caps. So when we remove this, they're actually just nuts that hold it on. It's not actually going to take off the whole bolt that holds on our main cap bearings for all these. So we're just going to have to go through, remove those all. Those are going to be a 9/16 nuts. We're going to take that out of here. As you can see, there's some sludge buildup and some other, carbon deposits on here. So I'm going to get this nice and clean before I put it back in there. But once that is off, it'll give us access to be able to remove our rear main bearing cap. And that is going to be way back here. Probably can't see it on camera, but I'll give you guys a shot when I do that. That's going to be closest to our transmission, our last bearing cap down here. When we remove our oil pan, our gasket is still kind of set into place up here on the engine. So that's what I'm going to do now, is just to pull this apart and drop this out of here. And while we have everything open like this, you want to be very careful not to get any crap up in there because you don't want dirt inside of your engine. So try to keep as clean as possible when doing this. And like I was saying earlier, since this was sitting for a week not running, there isn't a whole lot of oil dripping down. I mean, there is going to be residual oil, but it's not going to be dripping down in 20 different places. So that's going to be a nice thing while working on this upside down. So I got that gasket out of here. Now the next thing I'll work on is getting that engine girdle out of here through those 9/16 nuts. And an interesting fact about these Jeeps is a lot of the hardware that's around the body and everything, that's going to be metric, but everything that's inside the engine is still SAE. There's going to be a total of 14 nuts on this. Once you're down to the last couple, just put a hand here, because this will fall out of place. this will drop down, and then we can remove it. So right away, I'm also going to remove our oil pump, and that is held in by a couple of 1/2-inch hardware, it looks like, and that's going to come off with the pickup tube, so I'm going to break those free next. And I have an oil pan underneath, because once we break this free, oh, that was actually pretty loose right there. But once we break this free, there's going to be some more oil coming out, so you want to catch that. Actually not any oil really coming out here except for the end of our pickup. Alright, so I'm going to take a quick break from laying underneath the Jeep and actually get this oil pan and girdle all power washed and clean. I'm going to use some degreaser, get all the sludge out of here, and really clean this up so it's nice and clean. So I'm going to do that quick, and then we'll be back to change out the rear main seal. Alright, so it's time to tackle this rear main seal. So what you're looking at is the rear bearing cap closest to the back of the engine, back of the vehicle. We have to take off these two bolts. They're going to be a 13/16, so I'm going to zip those off, and then our rear bearing cap should come free from there. And then that is going to reveal half of our rear main seal that is in here. Now the other half is what's going to be a little bit more difficult. Once we have that off, we're going to basically use a punch and drive that upper portion of the rear main seal. It's going to drive it circular around the crankshaft, and then it's going to pull out on either side. So I'm going to break these free first. Now we're just going to wiggle this a little bit, and that should pop down. Might need to take a hammer, just kind of tap it a little bit side to side, but be very careful because that holds our rear main bearing, so we don't want to damage anything. There we go. So now with that removed, taking a look right here, it's pretty much flat with the engine block, but as you can see on either side we have this red right here, and that is the upper portion of our rear main seal. So what we're going to do is take a small punch that is smaller so we don't damage the engine block, and we're going to drive that seal, and it's going to pop out on the opposite side. And once you're punching this through, you're going to try and feel around. There's actually going to be inside that seal, there's a little support, I guess you can call it a wire. That's what you're going to want to try and hit against, so you're not just pushing on that silicone in there, you're actually pushing the structural part of that seal. So I'm going to start and get this in position. I don't have a long punch, so I'm going to have to deal with this little one, try and get in here the best I can. Alright, so it took a little bit, but once you initially break that surface tension free, it should come out. As you can see, it popped down over here on this side, and I'm just going to keep slowly pushing it through until I can't anymore with a punch. That's as far as I can go. I don't want to get that jammed in there. And now I'm just going to take a needle nose pliers and continue to pull it out on the other side and kind of pull it out in a radius motion, so it's going around that crankshaft. Now when you do take this off, kind of keep it in the position it was and make note of how this is orientated, because these only go in one way. You don't want to put this in backwards. Alright, and there it is. So what I mean by that is if you take a close look at the inside sealing surface that goes around the crank, there's little ridges on one side of the seal, and those little ridges point towards the front of the engine, towards the inside. So when we put the new one in, we're going to orientate that the same exact way. Alright, so before we put the new one in, we're going to do some more cleaning. Get this all cleaned up in here. This is pretty much the halfway point. I'm going to do everything at the same time while we have the oil pump off and the girdle and everything like that. I'm going to go and clean off the oil pan gasket surface over here on the engine block side, and then make sure I clean around where the bearing cap bolts up to over here where the rear main seal is, because we're going to have to put a little bit of RTV in those areas. So we want to make sure everything is nice and clean so stuff sticks and doesn't leak in the future. So I'm going to do that. Nothing much to it. Just going to take a rag with a little scraper and some brake clean and get this all cleaned up. Alright, so now with this rear bearing cap out of the vehicle, if we flip it over like this, we see our rear bearing right here. Doesn't look too terrible, no deep scores or anything like that, so that's fine. We're going to reuse that. But this red right here, that is our bottom piece of our rear main seal. Since this is the old one, we're going to remove it, so I'm just going to take some needle nose pliers and pull this guy out. It might be a little stuck in there. That's pretty stuck in there, but what's a similar construction to that piece we just took out on top. So it's got that metal ring that's inside here, so I'm just going to punch this down and see if I can break it free. And there we go. That is our old one. Now I'm actually going to clean this all up all around here, so I'm going to be scrubbing it. Since this backside right here, this is where our oil pan gasket seals up against, and it's pretty dirty, so I'm going to clean that. But I want to take off this bearing right here because I don't want it to get damaged in the process. It only goes in one way, since we got this little notch right here that kind of indicates where the position it should be in. So I'm just going to very carefully take this out. And then I'm going to set that to the side. And now I'm going to get this all cleaned up, and then we'll be ready to install our rear main seal. Alright, so it is time to put our new rear main seal in. I've got the new one just kind of soaked in oil, so that way this goes in nicely. Now when I put this in, I'm going to make note of where those ridges were on the inside of this sealing surface right here. So once again, that's going to be facing forward, so I'm going to orientate that in the correct position. And then I'm going to basically install this the way I took it out. So I'm going to wrap it around the crank on the bottom and then feed it through one side. And once we get it started, we're just going to do as much as we can by hand, rotating it on that radius. Now you can get most of the way with your hand. As you can see, I only have about a 1/4 inch left. That's where I'm going to delicately use that punch again and then work it around so that way it's perfectly flush in there on either side. And there we go, that is sitting good. Nice and flush in there. Now we're ready to install our bearing cap with the other half of the rear main seal. But before we do that, if you made any messes, since I did right here, I'm just going to wipe this down right where that other part of the rear main seal, where it has that weird flange, because that's where the RTV is going to stick. So we want to make sure that's nice and clean for that to go on there. Alright, so I got our cap all cleaned up. Main thing is we want to get this channel all cleaned out where our existing rear main seal was, and we also want to get this channel on the back side all cleaned up. Use some Scotch-Brite there because it's pretty gunked up. That's where our oil pan gasket's going to lie on, right there on the back side. But you still want to make sure you go through here with a pick, because there's actually pieces of the old rear main seal still kind of stuck in these corners right here, and the new one wouldn't be able to sit right if we still had those in there. So now I got everything all clean. I'm going to take our other half of our rear main seal right here, the one that has these two flanges on either end. Then I'm going to set this in. You can see they have this little indentation right here that matches up with how it is on this bearing cap. So I'm just going to set that in here. Push it in nice and firmly. Then I'm going to take our main bearing. I cleaned it all up. Set that back into place how it was. Just like so. Now I'm just going to take a little bit of oil on my finger and lube up this bearing right here. Make sure that doesn't go in dry at all. I'm going to put a little bit on the sealing surface right here, just in the semicircle area. Now one last thing we're going to do before we put this in is we're going to take a little bit of RTV and just put it on the surfaces right up here on top. And that's going to make sure this seals up nice and tight. And I'll just smooth this out a little bit with our finger. These gloves off. Alright, just like that, just a nice thin coat. Now I'm going to take this over to the Jeep and we'll get this installed. So I'll take our bearing cap and gently push it up into place. And then we'll take our bolts and start threading them in. Now I'm going to evenly tighten these down and then do a final torque of 80 foot-pounds. Alright, so now the next thing we're going to work on is putting the girdle back into place. Once again, we got 14 9/16 nuts holding this together, so we're going to thread them all into place and then do a final torque of 35 foot-pounds. Now one thing I did off camera is I went ahead and cleaned up all the hardware. I had them all soaking in some brake clean to clean up any of the crud and stuff that's on there. So when torquing these down, you want to start in the middle and then kind of work your way out in a circular pattern, kind of how you would for torquing down a head. So you kind of want to jump around from each side. So I'm going to torque this down to 35 foot-pounds. Alright, so the next thing we're going to tackle is putting this oil pump together and then getting it in the vehicle. As you can see right here, this is our oil pump. Then I also bought a new oil pump pickup, but you can reuse the old one off of your old pump. You just have to separate it and then reinstall it. But either way, we have to install it on the new pump right here. And the orientation that it goes in this open hole right there. Then it's also going to line up with the bolt hole that's on the oil pump right there. So this has to be a nice press fit into there. Now a little technique we can do to get this installed is actually take a wrench right behind this flange right here and then kind of hammer on the wrench to get that installed. But to help it a little bit more, I'm actually going to throw this in the freezer, so hopefully it contracts a little bit, and then we can stick this in there and hopefully it's a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to install. So I'm going to throw this in the freezer, then we're going to come back and then hopefully get this in there. Alright, so that didn't go how I wanted to at all. It wasn't really able to go in there even though I froze this. It was just trying to get that started into the hole is kind of a pain in the butt. Ended up just putting this in the vise and having someone hold this straight, then taking a 5/8 wrench, putting it right behind this flange right here, and then just hammering on that. It beat it up a little bit, but it should be fine. That's all in there now. We got our bolt hole that's lined up. That should be nice and tight in there and not moving. So that's ready to go right there. Next thing we're going to work on is our gasket right here that goes in between our engine block and the oil pump. Now they did come with a paper gasket, but as you can see from shipping, there's already a tear in there. So I don't have a replacement one on hand, so I'm still going to use that, but I'm going to use some RTV on both sides of that gasket and then put it on here. Then we shouldn't have any leaks. So I'm going to clean off this surface because there is some oil from shipping, and make sure that's nice and clean before we put some RTV on. So our gasket's going to sit right there. Put RTV on this side. And we're just going to do a nice thin coat. Slide that over, line up the holes, and then do the same thing on the other side. That little piece totally broke off, so I'm just going to put a little bit extra on this end. This isn't really the sealing point right here. This is just mounting the pump to the engine. Oil doesn't actually go through here. It should seal around this oil passage right here. Alright, so I got that on there. Now I'm going to go over to the Jeep and then we'll get this guy installed. Alright, so for installing this new oil pump, one thing to keep in mind when we put this back into the engine is that we have to kind of align our fork right here that comes off of the oil pump to basically the drive rod, which is essentially coming from the distributor. So if I look up into the hole here, I can kind of see the orientation that it's in. If you can't, you're basically just going to be kind of putting this in blind, and if it doesn't click into place, take it off and then slightly rotate this until you get that set into place, and then you can push it all the way up in there. So I got that set where I want it. There it goes. Drops into place, and I'll get our bolts and feed them into place as well. So now I'm going to snug these two bolts up evenly. The torque spec on these is 17 foot-pounds. I don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, so I'm just going to play it by feel. Alright, that is all in there. Now we're ready to keep going on with the process and getting that new oil pan gasket installed. Alright, so taking a look at our oil pan gasket. This brand, once again, is by FEL-PRO. And I like using the brand FEL-PRO because they really make it easy for you, such as the snap-up clips that we're going to be using here today. This is going to make it easy for the install. But this also came with a little instruction sheet, which is very useful. It basically indicates that you should also use this gasket with some RTV, which is what we're going to do, and to use it in all four corners where it meets the timing cover up front and then where it meets the rear main seal in the rear. And you want to get all four of those corners. We're actually going to be doing the whole entire semicircle surface on both ends and get a nice coat of RTV on both sides and get a nice even coverage of RTV on both sides of this gasket. Now it does say here that later on the 2000 and later year 4.0 is that the rear main seal design is actually a little bit different. It results in a little bit of a gap that you must use RTV on, so take note of that. This being a 99, we're still going to use RTV, but we won't have that newer rear main seal design change. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install these snap-ups. Now these install in all four corners where we have that 5/16 thread where that 1/2 inch hex drive was. So that's where these are going to thread into, and then we're going to put RTV on our gasket, and then we're going to put our gasket up into place, and then they're going to snap onto these plastic pieces that we installed up into there. Then from there, we're going to install our oil pan, and then our oil pan we're going to push up, and these are going to hold the oil pan in place while we get all of our hardware into place. So it's really going to make it easy, especially if you're working by yourself, so you can have that hold up into place while you're feeding it all your bolts. So first thing, let's head over to the Jeep. We're going to install these snap-ups into place, and then we're also going to wipe down one last time on the engine side, and then one last time on the oil pan that I previously all cleaned up. Just so we have nice clean surfaces, because if we get any debris that makes it on the gasket, we have a potential area for a leak, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Alright, so over on the front here, We're going to thread these guys into place. And they do have a flat slot on the bottom in case these get stuck while trying to remove them. You can fit a flathead screwdriver on there to get these off. So that does it for the front. Now we'll do the rear. Now, as far as the process and what I did to clean off of the gasket surface is I actually just used some Scotch-Brite that was soaked in some brake clean and just basically scrubbed all the way around, and it really broke up any of the baked on grease and any existing gasket that was on there. It's a clean enough surface right now. There's no any protrusions, but I'm going to hit it one more time, make sure it's nice and clean with some paper towel and brake clean, and then this should be ready to go. Alright, so back here with the gasket, I'm going to start by putting some RTV on. I'm putting it on the side between the engine and the gasket, and then once we get this gasket in there, then I'll do the underside of it, and then we can put the pan on. So I'm just going to put a bead along the back over here. And then up here on the front. And then I'm also going to put it over here because I noticed on my oil pan, for some reason, it's all bent in this one corner where this bolt is, and I don't want any leaks from there, so I'm just going to be a little bit cautious and put some RTV around that hole as well. So now with that on there, I'm going to take my finger, kind of smooth it out the best I can. Alright, so this is ready to go onto that Jeep and snap up into place on those plastic snap-ups. So now I want to be very careful on putting this in. I don't want to rub it up on anything that's greasy or anything like that. Want to carefully kind of push it up into the place where it's going to go. And instead of actually putting RTV now on the underside of this gasket, to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to go over to the oil pan and put it on the oil pan side and then get that in here. Now for probably the most difficult task, getting this oil pan in there without knocking into things or getting crap on the sealing surface. I took some bungee cords and kind of pulled the transmission lines away so that way we can fit this in there without any issues. There we go. Alright, that's popped up in the front. We'll go back here, pop it up in the rear. Alright, so update. The oil pan is in, and that whole process pretty much sucked and did not go as planned. The little snap-up clips that were supposed to be more helpful ended up being more of a burden. I was getting it up there, got the front clipped in, and then I was working on the back, and it felt like it was hung up. I thought it was against the starter. It might have been tight, so I kept pushing and ended up actually snapping all three of those snap-up clips clean off, and some of it went inside the pan, so I had to take everything all off again. It turns out with my suspension being as low as it can, it's not quite as low as to get a nice direct straight up with that oil pan. It needs to be able to snap up clean 3 inches front and rear at the same time, and I just didn't have the clearance with the axle in the way, so those snap-ups wouldn't work. It worked out better the last time I did this on my other Jeep, which had a higher lift. This only being a 3-inch lift, it was kind of a pain in the butt. If you have a stock height Jeep, it's going to be more of a pain in the butt as well. So what I ended up doing is taking off those snap clips and actually putting the oil pan in with the gasket on it right away. And to hold it in place, what I did was actually just use a zip tie and zip tied a couple holes on each side, and that held it in pretty tight. So I was able to get it up into place because it has to go in on an angle, and the front has to hit first and then the back goes up. So it's kind of crooked the way it goes on. That's why the snap clips didn't work. But once I got that up into place, I fed in a few bolts and then came around and cut off the zip ties and pulled them out cleanly, and that held everything up into place. So now we're at the point where I have all the bolts actually up into place. Now I'm going to torque everything down. And for the torquing these bolts down, it's nothing crazy. It's only about 10 foot-pounds. But we're going to go around a few times and torque these down little by little. The reason being we're going around a few times is because we want to tighten this down uniformly. And once you go around once and come back to where you started, you'll notice that the bolts are a little bit looser. That's because all the other bolts are pushing up on that as well. So that's exactly what we're going to do. And once again, tightening this up, we're going to start in the middle, kind of work our way out in a circular pattern, not going the perimeter all the way around, but kind of jumping all around. So it's tightening up that oil pan and working it from the inside out. So that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. Alright, so after finishing up torquing down those bolts, I went ahead and put all of the attachments that went onto the bolts for the oil pan, such as the transmission line holders and that O2 sensor connector holder over here on the driver's side underneath. Got that all finished up, and now we're at the point of adding oil into the engine. I already went ahead and swapped on the new oil filter, and I'm just putting in 6 quarts to start off with. It's probably going to take a little bit more since we drained a little bit more than a normal oil change, but I'm going to start off with 6 quarts. Check the oil right away. If it's still low, I'll top it off. And then after it's running, it's obviously going to go through the oil filter and drop down the level a little bit more, and then we'll top it off again there. Now before we start it, since we put in a new oil pump, we're going to have to prime the system. Now there is a certain way to do it where you're going to actually take off the distributor. There's a special priming tool you can stick on there with the electric drill and actually cycle that oil pump without actually turning the rest of the engine internals. I'm not going to do that today because I don't have that special tool. Some people can make some homemade ones out of a flathead screwdriver, cut it off and attach it on a drill. But instead what I'm going to do is actually just pull the fuel pump relay and crank the engine with the starter without it running until I see oil pressure. Then I'll throw that relay back in and then start it up. The reason why I'm not too concerned about cranking it without immediate oil pressure is because there's already still oil that's already on these bearings and everything in the engine. Now if this was a brand new engine without any oil and any oil passages or anything like that, I definitely would want to prime the oil pump without turning the rest of the engine internals. But I've done it this way before without any issues. These 4.0s are very forgiving, if you guys know that. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to finish putting the 6 quart in, check the oil, and then go from there. And I also left that engine mat off for now. I'm just going to leave it off for a couple of days just so I can monitor everything. If there's a leak that pops up, it'll be a lot easier to spot than having to deal with that engine mat in the way. I can put that on whenever I need to. So I'm going to go through the fuse box right here, and it's actually labeled fuel pump top left right here. I'm going to pull that relay out. Just leave that there for now. Now I'm going to crank on this till I see oil pressure. Might be a little bit. There we go. I got some oil pressure. We're going to put this relay back into place. We'll open the door and fire this thing up. drain back down to the pan and fill it up if we need to. Alright, so we're all finished up with this project here on this 99 Jeep Cherokee. Everything went well. It's actually been a couple thousand miles later and this thing is still running nice and strong. It has a lot more oil pressure, actually sometimes reaches up to 75 on a cold start once you rev it. Probably because the oil pressure sending unit's bad on this thing. A little bit off on there, but it definitely increased from what it was before and everything is going good. No signs of leaks or anything like that as well. But as you guys saw, we did have a couple hiccups along the way, but we powered through it and got it finished. If you have a friend that wants to help you on this, it definitely is easier with 2 people, especially getting that oil pan up into place, but definitely achievable with 1 person. If you have a lifted vehicle, it's going to make this job a lot easier. As you guys saw, the big thing restricting us was that axle kind of in the way. But if you have a smaller lift or if you have a stock tight suspension, you can disassemble a couple parts on the front suspension, such as the drag link and track bar and sway bar links, and that'll actually lower that suspension a little bit more in the front and give you a little bit more clearance. As always, I'll post a link below on all the products that I use in this. I'll post where all of the gaskets are, as well as that oil pump where you can get if you guys want to replace that as well for your project. But if you're following along, hopefully this video is helpful so you guys can do this on your own at home. And if you guys want to help support the channel, I got some out Jeeping decals over on my Etsy out Jeeping store. I'll post links down below. We got some new decal designs that we released a couple months ago that you guys can go and check out as well. So if you guys like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. And if you guys have any questions or comments, make sure to post them below and I'll be happy to get back to you. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.